이 박사, 전화했었어요? 아까 전화했었던 게 남아있었구나. 그래요. 그러면 한 수요일쯤 보는 걸로 해둡시다, 일단. 내일 모레쯤. 내일은 이 박사 강의 있으니까. 그래. 예. Hi, Valeria, Truina. Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you too.
Yeah. How was your reading? Have you submitted some summary, Valeria?
Mhm. I read.
Yeah. Did you submit the summary, some of your
Uh,
papers? Well, the reason
I
is,
still.
uh, yeah, you can submit later. You know, you don't have to rush. And if you read any article, take a summary and just submit to me. Okay? How about
Okay.
Paulina? Paulina, do you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Yeah, Paulina, I know you have submitted some papers summary. Did you?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay. How about Mikhail Soloyev, ISU? Well connected? Can you hear me? Mikhail Solovev? Maybe he doesn't hear me. How about Rogova, Ilulia?
good day, Professor. I hear you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for your work. And that makes you more interested in the subject. Uh, how about Valeria Turina? Valeria, do you hear me? Turina?
I hear you.
Oh, okay. Nice to hear your voice. How about Rogova Yulia? Rogova TSU? Can you hear me?
I do.
Yes. Have you submitted any summary assignment, Rogova?
I did all summary uh, 5.
Yeah. Okay. Very nice. Okay, then I will begin today's lecture. It's about Japanese economic development. Let me see if I can show you. Okay, see if I can show you. Show one. Yes, this is lecture one. And we went through last time several pages like the one. Japan was considered a country immensely rich in precious metals and so forth. First contact with Europe, very early history of samurai period, and trade with Europe. And also we moved to see with trade with Europe began at the beginning Portuguese trade, but switched mainly to Dutch. Dutch made use of, power struggle there, and ultimately Dutch dominated the trade with Japan. This is Portuguese carrack, means kind of commercial ship in Nagasaki, 17th century, full of people, full of commodities for trade. Economic development during the Edo period is characterized by very rapid urbanization, increased shipping of commodities, a significant expansion of domestic and foreign commerce, a diffusion of trade and handicraft industries. The construction trades flourished along with banking facilities and merchant associations. Increasingly, Han authorities oversaw the rising agricultural production and the spread of rural handicrafts. So you can see its early period, Edo period, Japan entered into foreign trade, being characterized by, for example, during this period, early Edo period, China was not moving ahead. China was very closed economy without that much trade. And as you know, Republic of Korea, South Korea, or North Korea, the Korean Peninsula itself was almost shut down by Lee dynasty. So, but during this Edo period, Japan moved ahead with very active trade and shipping and transportation and so forth. By the mid 18th century, Edo and other castle towns grew in size of population and trade. Osaka and Kyoto became very busy trading handicraft production centers, while Edo was the only center for the supply of food and essential urban consumer goods. Rice was the base of the economy. As the daimyo means kind of emperor of a regional empire, collected taxes from the peasants in the form of rice. Taxes were high, about 40% of harvest. To raise money, daimyo used forward contracts to sell rice that was not yet harvested. You see, this is a very interesting phenomenon. To raise money, tax, in other words, to kind of secure tax money inflow, daimyo, they created kind of forward contracts. So after 2 years, you sell the rice will be purchased by the government, and then much, 40% much will be taxed. So these are forward contracts, in other words, in advance. The rice was not there yet, but in 2 years, the rice harvest was contracted forward to collect, basically raise the money, the government use. These contracts were similar to modern future trade. Today, we sort of provide the example of forward contract in the form of modern future trading. Okay. The beginning of Edo coincides with the last decades of the Namban trade period, during which intense interaction with European powers on the economic and religious plane took place. At the beginning of the Edo period, Japan built her first ocean-going Western-style warships. At that time, worship is economic power, because if the country is engaged in war, it will be always in the form of a battleship fighting, warship fighting, rather than army going through the region. First battle is always carried out on the ocean. Ocean-going Western-style warship was the best asset, military asset. So in order to eradicate the influence of Christianization, Japan entered in a period of isolation called Sakoku. Sakoku means sa means is kind of a key. Okay. Koku means nation. So key to the nation. In other words, lock up the country. That's the meaning of sakoku. Sakoku, sa means kind of key. Okay. Koku means nation. 군인 or 국가 is a country. So you lock up the country. The meaning of sakoku is like locking up the country. And this period of isolation called sakoku, during which its economy enjoyed stability and mild progress. But not long after, in the 1650s, the production of Japanese export porcelain increased greatly when civil war put the main Chinese center of porcelain production. So in competition with Chinese porcelain, 1650s, Japan entered into the export market. For the rest of the 17th century, most Japanese porcelain production was in Kyushu area for export through the Chinese and Dutch. There is a so-called Korean descendant Korean descendant called 심수관, who was taken hostage. Or so, for example, Hideyoshi invaded Japan, I think around 19, around 1590. Then what happened is After the war, Hideyoshi, by him, emperor, Japan took hostage of famous Korean porcelain maker Simsukwan, and they moved to Kyushu area and became very famous porcelain center. And this is the trade dwindled on the renewed Chinese competition by the 1740s before resuming after the opening of Japan in the mid-19th century. Okay. So during the Edo period, Japan progressively studied Western sciences and techniques through the information books received through the Dutch traders in Dejima. The main areas that were studied included geography, medicine, natural sciences, astronomy, art, languages, physical sciences such as the study of electrical phenomena, mechanical sciences, as exemplified by the development of Japanese clock watches, wadoke, inspired from Western techniques. This is beautiful wadoke picture. And then they entered the Meiji area, Meiji period. After 1854, when the Tokugawa shogunate first opened the country to Western commerce and influence, Japan went through the two periods of economic development. When the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown and the Meiji government was founded, Japanese westernization began completely. First term, pre-war Japan, second term, post-war Japan. So this happened, Meiji government. Symbolically, Tokugawa shogunate means each region of Japan was governed by each smaller emperor called shogunate. There are Osaka area shogunate, Kyoto area shogunate, Hokkaido area shogunate, and so forth. But after Meiji period, Meiji government was founded, everything shogunate was overthrown and consolidated to the Western style government power. So that's what we mean by Meiji period. In the first half of the Meiji period, most labor disputes occurred in the mining and textile industries and took the form of small-scale strikes, spontaneous riots. The second half of the period witnessed rapid industrialization, the development of a capitalist economy with the transformation of many feudal workers to wage labor. So the transformation of feudal workers, this is a very important keyword. Feudal workers means very traditional industry workers to wage labor. Wage labor means main salaries and main wages are offered in the modern facility of factories. So the use of strike action increased in 1897 with the establishment of a union for metal workers. So the beginning of the modern Japanese trade union movement. So Japanese trade union movement went back to 1897. It's very important. Okay. End of the feudal system, Meiji period. With a relatively loose social structure, the Japanese people were able to advance through the ranks of society more easily than before. They were able to do this by inventing and selling their own wares. Japanese people now had the ability to become more educated. With a more educated population, Japan's industrial sector grew significantly. Implementing the Western idea of capitalism into the development of technology and applying to their military helped make Japan into both a materialistic, militaristic, and economic powerhouse by the 20th century. Western-based education system for all young people sent thousands of students to US and Europe, hired more than 3,000 Westerners to teach modern science, mathematics, technology, and foreign language in Japan. The government also built railroads, improved roads, and inaugurated a land reform program to prepare the country for further development. In the early Meiji period, the government built factories and shipyards that were sold to entrepreneurs at a fraction of their value. So encouraged entrepreneurship. So such family members like Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and all those business groups were founded through factories and shipyards. To promote industrialization, the private sector was best equipped to stimulate economic growth, and thus the greatest role of government was to help provide the economic conditions in which business could flourish. Many of these businesses grew rapidly into the larger conglomerates. Government emerged as chief promoter of private enterprise, enacting a series of pro-business policies. You see, you can see here the birth of Japanese and Korean style mixture of government and business. Pro-business policies helped promote private enterprise, enacting a series of pro-business policies. The development of banking, reliance on bank funding, have been at the center of Japanese economic development, at least since the Meiji era. Okay, so by the early 20th century, by 1928, the GNP of Japan at current prices peaked at 16.506 million yen in the mid-1930s. Japanese nominal wage rate was about 1/10 of US wage rate based on mid-1930s exchange rate, while price of Japan is roughly about 44% of price of the United States. So GDP per capita in terms of US dollar comparison between East Asian nations and the US in 1935. Very, very interesting estimates. Among the estimates, Professor Madison was once from the Dutch, from Netherlands. Professor Fukao is still my colleague. Yuta Chung is still, I think, active. These earlier estimates provide some interesting picture. For example, US GDP per person is about 5,590. Japan, 1745. Taiwan 1266, Korea 662. Isn't it interesting? Why per capita income in Korea is about half of Taiwan? Because Taiwan was far ahead of agricultural technology. Agricultural output was roughly double the Korea now. Therefore, GDP per capita in 1990 crisis shows the disparity between US, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. Okay. So Japan's per capita income, per capita GDP, about 3 times higher than Korea. Taiwan was roughly double the Korean income. Of course, depending on estimates, it's a little bit different. Before World War II, Japan built an extensive empire. Taiwan, Korea, Manchuria, and northern China, political and economic necessary to secure raw material and crucial sea lanes imported large amounts of social coal from Korea, Manchuria, and occupied China. And I saw, for example, the movie about the last emperor. Shows that Japan attempted to consolidate power through Manchuria, but ultimately failed by Soviet Union coming into Siberia and Manchuria. (1945) defeated him. Or ultimately gave up Manchuria. Since 1868, two periods of economic development we can think of. The first period, the Russo-Japanese War, 1905-04, 65% of employment and 38% of GDP was still based on agriculture, but the modern industry had begun to expand substantially during the Russo-Japanese War period. By the late 1920s, GDP contributed by agriculture, 21%, manufacturing and mining, 23%, service, 56%, including transportation, communication, and to sustain it, industrial development. In the 1930s, Japan suffered less from the Great Depression. GDP expanded at 5% a year. Manufacturing mining accounted for more than 30% of GDP, more than 2 times of agricultural GDP. But most of industrial growth was geared toward expanding the nation's military power. Beginning in 1937, with significant land seizures in China and annexations and invasions across Southeast Asia, the Pacific Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Please remember this keyword, Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So it encircles Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia to secure natural resources for economic independence, coal in China, sugarcane in the Philippines, petroleum from Dutch and East Indies, petroleum from Dutch in East Indies, and what else? And bauxite from Dutch East Indies and Malaya. So all this Greater East Asia prosperity under the slogan of so-called in Korean 대동아 공영권, Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere created to help out Japan in securing their raw materials, natural resources, energy sources, and so forth. Early stage of Japan's expansion benefited large industrial conglomerates called zaibatsu. Steel production increased in 1941. Japanese aircraft industry had the capacity of manufacturing 10,000 aircrafts per year. It's amazing industrial power. At that time, to be able to produce 10,000 aircrafts per year, you know, how much occupation, how much resources were needed to be mobilized. You know, it's a great deal of industrial power. Pacific War, Japan and occupied territories suffered severely. Inflation rampant, military needs, commercial requirements, severe shortfalls. So by the end of World War in 1945, shortages, inflation, currency devaluation, Japanese economy virtually stand still at the end of the war. Post-World War II, the world wiped out many of the gains which Japan had made since 1868. About 40% of nations' industrial plants and manufacturing was destroyed. This figure you may want to remember. About 40% of nations' industrial plants and infrastructure were destroyed after World War II in Japan. As Japan's second period of economic development began, millions of former soldiers joined the well-disciplined and highly educated workforce to rebuild Japan. Japan's colonies were lost as a result of World War II, but since then, the Japanese had extended their economic influence throughout Asia and beyond. A variety of US-sponsored measures during the occupation, such as land reform, contributed to the economy's later performance by increasing competition. US assistance totaled about 1.9 billion US dollars during the occupation, or about 15% of nation's imports and 4% of GNP in that period. About 59% of this aid was in the form of food, about 15% in industrial materials, 12% in transportation equipment, but not in military goods, which is different from Korean case. Korean case, military aid was about half of total aid by US. But the US assistance to Japan, mostly infra-related, investment-related, no military goods. The economy benefited from foreign trade because it was able to expand exports rapidly enough to pay for imports of equipment and technology without falling into debt, as had a number of developing countries in the 1980s. Okay. Gifts from heaven, bloodless democratic revolution from above ushered in by US forces that put an end to socially debilitating war. Reforms extending the right to vote to women, strengthening labor organization, unionization, liberalizing the economy, division and distribution of rural land to Chinese tenant farmers, the massive business conglomerates known as Zaibatsu that had effectively controlled the Japanese economy for almost 100 years were also broken up and faced market competition. Law for the elimination of excessive economic concentration, law on the expulsion of Zaibatsu. The early post-war years were devoted to rebuilding lost industrial capacity. More major investments were made in electric power, coal, steel, and chemicals. Between 1953 and 1965, GDP expanded by more than 9% per year. This is what I define Japan's medium growth period. In other words, Japan built industrial power by pursuing very stable but high growth period for roughly 20 years. Manufacturing and mining 18%, construction by 11%, and infrastructure by 12%. In 1965, these sectors employed more than 41% of the labor force, whereas only 26% remained in agriculture. So Japan's highly acclaimed post-war education system contributed strongly to the modernizing process. The 1973 oil crisis shocked an economy that had become dependent on imported petroleum. Although the investment costs were high, many energy-intensive industries, especially successfully reduced their dependence on oil. during the late 1970s, 1980s, enhanced their productivity. Advances in circuitry and semiconductors in the late 1970s and 80s led to the new growth industries in consumer electronics and computers and to a higher productivity in pre-established industries. Japan experienced a slower growth in the mid-1980s, but its demand-sustained economic boom of the late 1980s survived many troubled industries. Okay. So nations' pre-war experience, post-war World War II factors of growth. First factor is nation's pre-war experience, Tokugawa period, vital commercial sector in burgeoning urban center, well-educated elite of sophisticated government bureaucracy, productive agriculture, a closely unified nation with highly developed financial and marketing systems, and the national infrastructure of roads. Meiji Road, post-war growth. Level and quality of investment in capital equipment, which averaged more than 11% of GNP. And during the pre-war period, rose to about 20% of GNP during the 1950s, and more than 30% in the late 1960s and 1970s. So as you have witnessed, Republic of Korea followed the same route with 11% of GNP during the pre-war period, started to 20%, 30% in the late 1960s, 1970s. Latecomer to modernization. Japan was able to avoid some of the trial and error earlier needed by other nations to develop industrial process. In the 70s, 1980s, Japan improved its industrial base through licensing from the US, patent purchases, and imitation and improvement of foreign investments. Labor force availability, skill, educated, literacy, reasonable wage demands, extraordinary saving rates, accompanying levels of investment went up, low growth of labor force, high productivity of growth incurred. So economies of scale. Before World War II, large holding companies formed wealth groups and Zaibatsu, which dominated most industries. The Zaibatsu were dissolved after war, but Keiretsu. Keiretsu means subcontracting through different divisions. Large modern industrial enterprise groupings emerged. The coordination of activities within these groupings and the integration of smaller subcontractors into the groups enhanced industrial efficiency. So growth-oriented corporations, product diversification, international conflicts. Okay. So agricultural sector, as late as 1955, 40% of labor force still worked in agriculture, 17% by 1970, 7.2% right now, under 5% in the 21st century. Japan's economic growth in the 60s, 70s was based on rapid expansion of heavy manufacturing in such areas of automobile, steel, shipbuilding, chemicals, and electronics. South Korea followed this Japanese economic growth exactly from 1970s to 1980s with about 10-year or 15-year time lag. From the late 1970s, the Japanese economy began to move away from heavy manufacturing toward a more service-oriented base. So post-World War II, 1980s situation, by 1970s, was the largest GNP country. Japan became. From US dollar 9,068 in 1980 to 23,801 in 1990. Within 10 years, they increased GDP like 2.4 times. Mild economic slump in the 1980s, expansion followed in 1986 to 1992, recessionary period after 1992. Unlike the economic booms of 1960s and 70s, when increasing exports played a key role in economic expansion, domestic demand propelled the Japanese economy in the late 1980s. So economic restructuring from dependence on exports to reliance on domestic demand. So the growth in high technology industries in the 1980s resulted from heightened domestic demand for high technology, for higher living, better medical service, expanded leisure time of facilities, improved ways to accommodate a rapidly aging society. During the 1980s, the Japanese economy shifted its emphasis from primary and secondary activities so the growth in high technology industries in the 1980s resulted from heightened domestic demand for high technology products, higher living standards, better medical care standards, expanded leisure time facilities, improved ways to accommodate a rapidly aging society. So during the 1980s, Japanese economy shifted its emphasis from primary and secondary services to processing with telecommunication and things like that. Post-War II, the end of the Cold War, 1989 economic bubble came through after the collapse of bubble, financial repression during 19 late 1980s, 80s and 90s, and the lost decade of the end of the 20th century is called collapse of bubble in Japan, deflation from 1990s to present. So if you cannot feel the sort of long deflation, for example, this is some chart that I came up with Japan's post-war GDP growth rate. And I'm paying attention to this period, medium growth period, 1971 through 1990, roughly 20 years, 4.8%. Very decent growth rate was maintained in Japan. But in case of South Korea, after 1997, medium target growth rate has not been established. Growth rate was very skyrocketingly slowed down. So South Korea did not enjoy Japan's 20 years like medium target period. For example, this is the research done by myself when I was a visiting scholar at University of Tokyo. At the time, 1997 crisis is here, financial crisis. What we did is to estimate rates of return to capital in selected countries. And rates of return to capital can be constructed like this. Total GDP and minus wages and salary divided by that by 100 times total GDP. In other words, out of total national income, you deduct wages and salaries, total. So you are left with only capital income. Capital income divided by total capital stock is by rates of return that we estimate. Okay, so if you see it here, Japan and Korea became outlier, reaching about 30% of total rate of return. What does that mean? If you invested 100 during this period, Japan and the United States, Japan and Korea, they could have earned 30% in return in capital income. But as I show you here, Japan's rate of return is declining around 1975 when Plaza Accord was agreed, because Plaza Accord means all the nations other than Japan were running trade deficit. So currency realignment, yen adjustment through Japan's rate of return had to fall. And following this pattern, Korea's rate of return exactly followed Japan's rate of return. And showing that to both of these two nations, both Japan and Korea's recent 1995 estimates is even below OECD average. So near 1995, Korea and Japan were already very low rate of return stage, and which probably was caused by financial crisis in 1997 in case of Korea. More recent picture of Korea's rate of return to capital in South Korea is very rapidly declining. Okay. And this ends the first Japan's introduction. We will take a 5-minute break for tea and then come back to, I think, probably Yes, another version of Japanese economic rules, lecture 2. We will get back to this slide after 5-minute break. Thank you. Okay, I'm back with the second version of Japanese economic development. This is based on, for example, Ogawa and Rozovsky, very famous Japanese expert scholars. Rozovsky from Stanford University, Ogawa from Hiroshibashi University. So two Japanese economic historians got together and wrote a book on Japanese economic growth. So this might be a worthwhile to supplement what we have learned today. The pre-modern background 100 years ago, the mid-19th century, the world economy, European powers at center stage, US just emerging as a major contestant for world power. In Asia, India, colony, China attractive for colonial ambitions due to vast population and resources. Today, Europe's role became relatively diminished. Russia and US, superpowers, China ever stronger. Japan became a major industrial power. Its GDP rate is GDP is in the third rank after US and Soviet Union. So this background after 100 years has changed a lot, right? Japan's transformation or modernization, not confined to economies, nearly all facets of corrupt life. Japan became world leader, the only country of non-European origin to have achieved full modernization by three spurts. So Japan's full modernization by three spurts. These three spurts we remembered. First, after the Russo-Japanese War, 1905. 1917 to World War I, 1918, 4.56%, very rapid. By then criteria, 4.56% growth rate is very rapid, followed by slower growth during the 1920s. During the 1920s, slower growth was inevitable because world recession, economic depression started 1929. Therefore, of course, Japan's rapid growth slowed down. During 1930s, developed at a most impressive pace, GDP growth rate 5.871%. Because this, I think, it has some substitution effect. In other words, 1930s, Japan, for example, United States after 1929 depression could not survive very well, could not recover very well. On the other hand, Japan relatively not much affected by the Great Depression. Therefore, Japan had more industrial power, energy, so GDP growth rate 5.71%, 1930s. 1956, 1962, 10.7, 11.91%. So this is the period we can define Japan's economic miracle. That's what I mentioned, Japan's medium target growth rate, over 10%, 11% growth rate was achieved. Based on absorption of modern Western technology by private investments. So this is the key for industrialization. And relatively, Korea lacked this period of economic miracle and lacked absorption of modern Western technology by private investments, relatively speaking. Before 1868, traditional feudal rule of Tokugawa shogunate, not much different from other backward Asian countries. But 1868, the restoration of the Meiji Emperor fronted for a new government for economic growth. So Meiji restoration was the key to transform from traditional feudal Tokugawa shogunate toward the emperorship. Toward the end of Tokugawa rule in the 1980s, 80% was peasants with average size of slightly less than 1 hectare, but some worked in crafts and trade in cities to supplement their income. Craft and services used labor-intensive methods that depended for gains in productivity in the skills of individual workers. Fixed capital was only a minor element in the production function. 1867, so-called closing of the country, Sakoku, decree by Shogun Iemitsu, 1867. Exception, the Dutch and the Chinese allowed limited trading rights in Nagasaki. So Dutch made a lot of money because it was almost like monopoly during closing of the country period. Commodore Perry and his ships finally arrived, opened Japan. An isolation policy may have created sources of inner strength. Industrial revolution in Great Britain, absence of international context, only second-best technology and organization can occur. So population in the early 60s, 25 million, 1860, 30 million, 1700, 1840, 150 years, population remained stable due to infanticide. Infanticide means in Japanese mabiki. That is the childhood who dies at early age. We call infanticide. And more advanced than many countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, low per capita income, poor organization, corruption, lethargy means slumber, coma, and undernourishment. These things were characterized in many countries, Africa, Latin America, low per capita income countries. Effective at both central and government, the capital and the major cities were under direct control. 200 baronies or fiefs headed by a lord or daimyo gets income stream, a privilege to levy a yearly harvest tax. So these baronies and fiefs headed by a lord, daimyo, when they make a big procession, then their income stream gets very high. A yearly harvest tax rate is imposed. So major arteries crisscrossed the country, and both goods and people moved relatively very rapidly. Sankin Kodai means alternate residence, 1 year in capital and 1 year in the provinces. It's like a daimyo, regional captain, regional emperor was kept 1 year in capital and another year in provinces. For example, one emperor from Hokkaido area, he has residence in capital, Tokyo or Kyoto, and another residence in Hokkaido area, so that he became kind of hostage families because he cannot run against the government activity because then he becomes hostage families. So he tends to behave well, not rebelling against central government, prevented a rival and local power base. And during this alternate residence moving ceremony, colorful daimyo procession had to follow. Roads, inns, restaurants, etc. were booming. So it's kind of another way of industrializing activity, commercializing activity. Housing and clothing, and clothing becomes very indigenous, dress beautiful, cuisine attractive, and so that made a lot of cuisine and clothing attractive, housing attractive. This Sankin Kodai is a kind of alternate residence system, has moved commercially very well, Japanese society. So that is an example. Edo, Kyoto, Osaka, among the largest cities in the world, high average standard of education, that is 40 to 50% males formally attending schools. Official class structure is bush samurai status, gentry, farmers, and merchants. In Tokugawa, Japan, the gap between economic and other backwardness was unusually large, made the prospects of modern economic growth all the more promising. The capability of borrowing and absorbing more advanced methods based on well-functioning socio-political infrastructure. So the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the last Tokugawa shogun voluntarily surrendered power to the imperial family, to the young Emperor Meiji, an epochal event in Japanese history, a favored example of modernization. A renewed foreign threat, no more isolation but modernization. Discontented lower-ranking samurai, of course, made a rebellion efforts, but a secular economic deterioration as a result of rising expenditure by the Tokugawa and other domains. The years of transition, the Meiji period in two sub-periods, 1865, 1885, 1886 to 900. Initial shock of Western context was observed at of course, the first sub-period. The institutional reform spearheaded by the government. Both noble, warriors, peasants, merchants, and outcasts, two new classes, a small nobility, and everyone. By 1876, pensioning of all warriors opened all internal travels and ports to external visitors. Okay, by 1876. This is Kurofune. Kuro means black. Fune means ship, the black ship. Refers to Mississippi, Plymouth, Saratoga, Susquehanna, of the Perry expedition for the opening of Japan, 1852-1854. That arrived July 14, 1853 at Uraga Harbor, part of the present Yokosuka in Kanazawa Prefecture, Japan, under the command of United States Commodore Matthew Perry. Black refers to the black color of the older sailing vessels and the black smoke from coal-fired steam engines of the American ships. In this sense, the Kurofune became a symbol of the ending of the isolation. It only occurred in 1852. Remember, China's Opium War was 1840s, and China was forced to open. Japan, after 10 years, is opening again after black ship arrived. And after 1874, Korea followed Japan in opening their ports. So it's only 10-year difference. Turning point in momentous event created Japan, modern Japan. The land ownership from the emperor to peasants who have to pay heavy land tax to the central and local government. The tax was levied on asset valuation of the land at national uniform levels. Currency and banking reforms created the Bank of Japan in 1889, establishing regulations in private banking system. Model factories, foreign experts hiring and sending students abroad. Severe inflation followed by a harsh Mascata deflation by 1885. 15 years after 1885, uninterrupted development of modern industry skill, silk and cotton spinning started. Road building, railroads, general public works by the government followed. So this is some statistics, structure of the major economy, 1936 prices. For example, output by industry, look at manufacturing and mining, sharply increased from 316 to 672, right? Resource allocation, for example, and gainfully occupied population, manufacturing and mining, and increased sharply from 2909 to 269. So it's discussing, showing the transformation between 1887 to 1902. Okay. So it's their series. For example, A is annual series, B is a smoothed series. And if you can see it, Japan's economic growth started from 1890 Meiji Restoration, started very slowly, but very steadily increased until 1945, when World War II ended. And then A series, B series means very rapid growth rate after 1970, 50. Okay. So this shows Japanese economic growth rate in two spots. This shows transformation, GNP and GNP per capita average annual rates. For example, panel A, panel B, for example, panel A, GNP per capita. You can see total GNP increased sharply. GNP per capita increased most effectively, highest growth rate 1912, 1917, and 1931, 1937, and 1956 to 1962. You can see GNP per capita very rapidly increasing, as documented by Rosowski and Ogawa. This is GNP average annual rate of growth. You can see jump here after 1955. 1910, 1920s, high growth period, repeated 1930 to 1935, and then jumped after post-war period. It's their estimate again, GNP per capita, growth rate-wise, 1937 to 1956, 1956 to 1932, highest, 3.89%. Between peak and trough, trough means bottom. When recession comes, we say trough. So from peak to trough years, duration is showing up. Okay. So long swing age growth rates, you can see, identify by Rosowski statistics. A schematic growth path now up to 1930s, 1945, it was smooth. And then after that, jump. You can see. Okay. This is the, some chart with the tables provided by Okawa and Rosowski, two very famous Japanese scholars. Okay, so this will conclude modern economic growth in Japan. My plan next week is about North Korea. North Korea is almost forgotten from the discussion of East Asia. But as you know, North Korea is a very important nation, for not only military power purpose, but also future risk and future East Asia depends on North Korea. So to some extent, we know very little about North Korea because North Korean statistics are not revealed regularly. And we cannot really rely on revealed statistics. But some years ago, I was invited by OECD as the first OECD seminar on North Korea. And there I obtained important review papers by OECD. And also I presented my own version, how North Korea can get out of a poverty trap and can be on a sustainable track, sustainable development plan package, and my own prescription and my own paper that I presented that in OECD seminar. I will try to send 2 papers in advance, just after today's class. And I hope you could be able to read in advance at least these 2 papers and be prepared for listening to next class. So next class will be final class for this course after covering North Korea. And then the following week, we will have final exam. That's shared our course outline. So today I will stop here, and please, if you have any comments or questions, please send it to my email address. Thank you.